Okay, so welcome back. I want to talk with you about the achievement gap, also in context. We are going to engage in an activity next week where we will get to take a look at, very literally, take a look at and consider the ways in which the achievement gap is more traditionally understood and articulated in an activity that you might be interested in. Thinking about replicating in your work with schools and communities. Call it a data equity walk. But for right now, I want to hold on to a little bit about this achievement gap in context. An important piece of thinking about the achievement gap is thinking about opportunity gaps. And one of the ways that is most pronounced is thinking about segregation in our public schools. One of the articles that I asked you to read for our first week together was called Brown at 60, Great Progress, A Long Retreat, and an Uncertain Future. And, that article really talks about these 6 decades of separate but equal have now been followed by 6 decades of separate is inherently unequal as our basic law. And, really looking at the ways in which desegregation through that court decision has been followed by continued and severe levels of racial segregation in our schools. We see major and pronounced regional differences in the composition, racial composition of our schools. And, immediately following the Brown decision, was really significant for Black students in the South. We saw significant changes between the 1960s into the late 1980s, and many thought the South would go back to prior levels of segregation, rather. And while the gains post 1967 we really haven't. We've had losses since those gains in 1967. The South is still really the least segregated area for Black students in the country. We've seen most growth of segregation for Latino students, particularly in the western part of the United States. Again, as the article notes, a very clear pattern where Black and Latino students tend to be together more often in schools where there's a substantial majority of poor children, whereas Asian and white students tend to be in more middle-class schools and settings. And so, we're definitely seeing the ways in which race and poverty come together to form additional layers of segregation in our public school system. Not surprisingly, this follows a very long history of both implicit and explicit policies and laws that directly segregated people of color from white folks. Policies like redlining in housing and community areas, have had generation after generation of effect, and that lives on. And so we definitely see the ways in which our schools are funded in very different ways. We looked at, some of the ways that California has been trying to mitigate some of that through the local control funding formula. But we still see this really incredible levels of segregation in our schools. And we know the data shows that, for all races and for all groups of students and for all income levels, more diverse student populations are better for all students in terms of outcomes. I think another powerful post, Brown at 60, and in fact, at this current moment when this is being recorded, we're actually now 65 years after Brown v. Board. And I posted an article from Education Week that recently came out about that said, where are all the Black educators 65 years post-Brown? And this is an area that we'll get into a little bit more in the next lecture, where we talk about some of Lisa Delpit's work. Reminding us of the important loss, the powerful and detrimental loss for Black students in particular, of having Black educators and administrators. Following Brown, there was a tremendous exodus of teachers of color, Black teachers in particular, who were replaced by white teachers. The ways in which that impacts, whether or not Black students feel seen, experienced, heard, and whether the curriculum is relevant, has been impacted by this mass exodus, to be sure. Another important part of our public policy legacy is the fact that the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act also recently came into being under the Obama administration, and even under Obama, not to mention under the Trump administration. A lot of policy folks have said they're not sure that the Civil Rights Act could be signed again today, that it really took some powerful steps forward in the midst of many, many decades and hundreds of years of oppression and acts of white supremacy that really formed segregation across the country in education and other sectors. Where are we now, right? Would politicians in this moment who are quite partisan, would we be able to sign the same legislation at this point? I think is a powerful question for us to consider as we think about what it means for us to do policy work in this moment. I want to turn the mic over literally to this program called the program Teachers for Social Justice. There's a 15-part series that was put together. It should be noted it was in 2015, called The Battle for Public Education in the 21st Century. And this first section I'm going to invite you to listen to is called Inequity by Design, which kind of allows us to step back and consider the ways that the public school system was created. When we think about the achievement gap, right, we're thinking about what is achievement and who defines that achievement, and the gap between what and what, right? So I want to think about the ways in which inequity may have been and has certainly been kind of built into the school system from its inception. So I want to give some space for that as we consider this topic. As noted, this was produced in 2015. At that time, we were working under the Obama administration, and our Secretary of Education was Arne Duncan. And so I just want to recognize that. You may hear mention of him in these two sections, and just want to clarify that piece. So let me step back, and I'll be back in a little bit.
The Battle for Public Education in the 21st Century. I'm Ken Yale, education correspondent for Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio.
Yeah, feel this from the bottom of my heart, y'all. Truly inspired. Here we go. Come on, look, yo, just teaching to the test. Forced by the feds, or they losing that check. Too many children left behind by this corporate assembly line. How they privatize education is a human right, and their kids gonna be fine. They send them to private schools, while ours get sent to prison or given a job serving fast food.
This is the second of several programs on the history of public education. Today's show is entitled Inequity by Design. In our last program, we explored the ways traditional indigenous peoples viewed the world and educated their youth before European colonizers and settlers arrived in North America. In today's show, we'll look at the very different Eurocentric paradigms that have largely shaped public education in the United States since then. To help us make the bridge from our last program into today's, here is Rose Von Totter-Brand, a Tuscarora woman and the co-founder and director of the Native American Academy.
The very heart of Indigenous learning is relationship. Education in the Native way is not bounded by a structure or limited by only people that are anointed to teach you within a certain time frame. We learn through relationship, through dream, through ceremony, through song. We learn in community. We learn intergenerationally. But it all really comes down specifically to relationship to place and an understanding of our place in the whole of things. In the indigenous world, human beings are not seen as greater than or lesser than. They are just equal to every other form of life. We belong to the earth. It does not belong to us. What is not taught in the Western education system is that there was a fully functioning, vibrant, rich culture and knowledge flourishing on these lands when they arrived. Because of their cultural lens and their inability to perceive it, they then, through germs, guns, and steel, were able to develop, and out of that development came a hegemonic education system. Now, there's been assault after assault to attempt to break down the sovereignty, and obviously the treaties have been broken many times, to really break apart the culture, to force assimilation. It cannot be done, and it hasn't been done, and ultimately it will not be done. And I think that one of the things that is so difficult for the United States to come to grips with is the truth of our history. You've got to uncover and let the wound be seen, recognized, and healed.
We'll hear more from Rose von Tauter-Brand in later programs, but now we're going to take up her challenge and grapple with the early history of U.S. public education. Our guide is Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco and founding director of the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education.
I like to think of the history of public schooling in this country by thinking about where were we drawing from? What were the ideas that we were drawing on as we thought about what schools could look like here in this nation? And so maybe before I talk about the United States, I should talk a little bit about Western Europe, which is where a lot of our ideas came from. Industrialization was happening in Western Europe far before it came to the United States or the North American continent. And what we know is that hand in hand with industrialization was also the continuing colonization of Western European powers throughout the world. So when I think about mass schooling or schooling for the masses, I think about what was happening in these countries both abroad and domestically. And so as they were colonizing countries around the world, they needed to create school systems that would help people to self-govern, that would help people to assimilate into a different social and economic and political structure where they were learning to fit towards the bottom of that hierarchy. So mass schooling was in large part a form of socialization for the colonized. And what we see is that parallel to what we're building in other nations abroad what was happening domestically. So as these nations were also going through industrialization, hand in hand with industrialization is often urbanization and the growth of large cities, moving around of people from space to space, which means suddenly we now have these large populations, many newcomers to the area who have to learn how to fit in. So mass schooling, even domestically within these Western European countries, was about socialization, was about teaching the masses to fit into a particular structure of society. What I think is interesting is then to think about the emergence of public education here in this country. And we often think about public education as all about equal educational opportunity and preparing all students to succeed and all of that, leveling the playing field. But the reality is that public education in this country, its predecessor is known as common schools. And common schools emerged in the late 1700s. It was really thriving as a movement until around the Civil War. So for almost a century, we had this thing called common schools, which is kind of this mixture of public and private. And it tended to be one-room schoolhouses. It tended to be very small schools that were serving some of the more elite in this nation, right? Before the advent of common schools, how were we teaching children? Well, we were teaching them through tutors that maybe wealthier families were bringing in. Different groups of people were giving different education to their children, right? Boys were getting different education from girls. White children were getting different education from children of color, and so on. Well, the common schools was therefore for the more elite. It tended to be boys from white American families and families that owned property. And what we see in the common school era was that even way back then, academics were not the only thing that was the purpose of schooling. academics went hand in hand with moral education and socialization, right? The most common reader at the time, for decades really, was called the McGuffey reader, which was teaching students to read by using really this kind of fire and brimstone Protestant stories about how, you need to kind of follow the teachings of the church or you'll perish in hell kind of thing. So it was very hard, even way back then, to separate academics from moral education. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Socialization has always been a goal of education, whether we're talking about the masses or the elite. But then what we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s was a major shift, because at this time in this nation, we were going through our own industrial revolution. And coinciding with industrialization was the growth of large cities. So industrialization went hand in hand with urbanization, which also went hand in hand with immigration. Large groups of people were immigrating from particularly European nations at the same time that we were building these larger and larger cities. So all of a sudden now we were at this place where we were asking ourselves, well, how do we kind of control this large population, many of them newcomers to this country? And so it's not surprising that this was the time when we saw large public urban systems begin to develop, particularly in metropolitan areas in this country. And what's interesting is that the schools that we developed now for the masses looked really quite different than the schools that we were developing a century earlier for the more elite. The schools for the masses began to really mirror a lot of the elements that we saw in factories. So we began to divide students much more. We divided them by age. We divided them by, and many times, gender. And we also began to compartmentalize the work that they were doing, just as we see in factories. So we began to divide by subjects and divide by time and so on. And it's also the case that the curriculum became less about kind of thinking and reading and writing and expression and creativity. It became much more about rote memorization, much more a curriculum that really taught you to follow rather than taught you to lead. And this is the beginning of public education, right? So we could say, yes, public education began for the most elite, and as we were forced to integrate more and more people, we came up with more and more ways to sort students. I like to make the argument that although we often say the purpose of education is around helping everyone to succeed, leveling the playing field, equal educational opportunity, the function of schools has always been to sort and differentiate. We just came up with more and more indirect ways to accomplish that.
We'll come back to Kevin Kumashiro in a moment, but as we think about his description of a public education system designed to sort and differentiate based on race, class, gender, and nationality, let's hold the indigenous view present in our minds. Check out these words from George Galvis, the director of Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice.
In 1492, we had a clash between two irreconcilable worldviews. One that's manifested today by the concept of maximize profits, minimize expenditures, where we value money before people, but at that time was manifested by what I refer to as the 3 Gs, greed, gold, and genocide. And our indigenous worldview, which is reflected in many different ways across indigenous cultures across the globe, but we say in the Lakota language, mitaki asen, all my relations. In the Mayan language, we say, in Lakesh, you are my other self, or in Spanish, tú eres mi otro yo, I'm a reflection of you, you're a reflection of me. We are interconnected. Every young person, that's the first teaching they need to have, is a sense of connection.
Now back to Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. I asked him to say more about who has been included in the public education system historically and who has not.
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, when common schools were created, one of the ideas was that we should teach everyone a common curriculum. The ideal was also that it would be free. But free for whom is really the important question, right? And obviously it was not meant for the peasants. It was not meant for the day laborers. It was not meant for enslaved peoples. And it was not even meant for girls in many instances. So we began to broaden who we think schools were for. But even when we agreed that different groups of students, particularly those from the margins of society, should be allowed into schools, we began to create separate schools. So in the 1800s, what we saw was many separate schools being created for girls, separate schools being created for people of darker skin. And certainly by the late 1800s, we were seeing really a burgeoning of schools for different groups of people. And a really great example would be the burgeoning of boarding schools for American Indian students, right? That really proliferated all throughout the country in the late 18 and early 1900s, as well as even for immigrant populations. I can think of schools that were created for Asian immigrant students in Hawaii, which is where I grew up. And in both the schools for the Asian immigrant students, as well as the schools, the American Indian boarding schools, what we see here is a very explicit goal of Americanization. The major goal here was to teach students where they fit into the structures of this society. And in fact, one of the kind of unofficial mottos or mantras of the American Indian boarding schools was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, right? It was about losing parts of yourself that we devalue as a nation so that you can fit into a particular space that we're creating for you in this nation. And you could argue that throughout education, even as we began to incorporate more and more people, the curriculum was still one that differentiated, right? So there are many ways to sort. We can sort through separate schools. We can sort through separate classrooms as we do through tracking, but we can also sort ideologically through the curriculum and what we teach and how we then expect you to participate in the society.
Let's leave the history here for today and reflect on what we've heard as we listen again to George Galbis. He is speaking to educators and community activists at an Oakland summit about the school-to-prison pipeline.
And I kind of want to take a moment to just dispel this myth of the failure of public schools, the failure of policing and confinement to achieve public safety and justice, and just say that failure is by design. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
So let's just talk a moment about the origins of what the first prisons were. The first prisons were the slave plantation and the reservation. The first police were the slave catchers and the cavalry.
That's right.
So I feel like we need to place it in its proper social historical context to know exactly what it is that we're dealing with. And boarding schools and education weren't about empowerment. They were about miseducation and indoctrination.
That's right.
So how we now, in our roles as educators and community workers, are attempting to shift that culture within a system that by design was to help maintain social control in our oppression, I think is the challenge.
Our guests today have challenged us to honestly face our history. That's especially important for all of us who want a more socially just educational system, because how we name and contextualize a problem impacts how we choose to solve it. The problems in education are not just rooted in individual attitudes or practices. How many of us knew that by the 1830s, most southern states had laws that forbid teaching slaves how to read, or that in 1852, 2 years after California became a state, the legislature passed a bill barring African American children from schools, or that in 1864, the U.S. Congress made it illegal for indigenous peoples to be taught in their native languages. How is this still resonating in today's laws that prevent the children of undocumented immigrants from attending public schools, or in the attacks on bilingual education and ethnic studies? Connecting the dots between the past and the present shines a light on the inequities that have been deeply rooted in the design, structure, and fabric of public education. That inequity, while it has changed forms over the centuries, is still solidly ingrained at the foundation of our educational system today.
Okay, thank you for your attention to that section, Inequity by Design. My hope is that, as we continue forward with this topic, you will continue to bring, what you have taken away from this and other parts of our reading and listening into our future activities as we explore the achievement gap. In this next section, pay attention to that man behind the curtain in a reference to The Wizard of Oz. We hear from folks including Diane Ravitch, who was herself conservative under the George H.W. Bush administration, working on education policy and the ways in which she's really changed her perspective. So it's kind of, I think, a unique opportunity to hear her kind of pick apart various sides of questions about high-stakes testing and also charter schools, which are very much questions that still remain with us in this moment. So let me step back and you can take a listen to this section that will help us kind of place No Child Left Behind in a little bit of context as we continue forward thinking about where we are in the current policy arena.
Welcome to our series, The Battle for Public Education in the 21st Century. I'm Ken Yale, education correspondent for Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio.
Yeah, feel this from the bottom of my heart, y'all. Truly inspired. Here we go, come on, look, yo, just teaching to the test, forced by the feds, or they losing that check. Too many children left behind by this corporate assembly line. How they privatize education is a human right, and they kids gonna be fine. They send them to private schools, while ours get sent to prison or given a job serving fast food. Cash rules.
Today's show is entitled Pay No Attention to That Man Behind the Curtain. We saw in previous programs that civil rights and liberation movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s challenged centuries of educational inequity. Some fought for equal access to the educational system, while others created new models, like freedom schools, that directly linked education to liberation and social justice. Today's program will examine how wealthy and powerful interests pushed back against those gains and imposed a new agenda for corporatized education in this century. This is Dr. Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco, talking about the roots of today's so-called educational reform.
We can see a lot of growth of conservative movements in this country as very much responsive to the civil rights movement, right? A lot of conservative organizations, think tanks, foundations, that whole network. And so a new movement took birth, right, in the 70s, but particularly gaining speed in the 80s. This movement has absolutely turned a lot of its attention to education. So a lot of what we see as school reforms today had its birth in conservative organizing decades earlier, including things like how we think about standards and accountability, things like the achievement gap, things like certain ways that we talk about racial inequities. They actually have their births in the 1980s with a lot of the work that the conservative movement was doing. So it is important, again, that we question, where do we get these frames? Where do we get these ideas? What has become really commonsensical? And are we really appreciating the history of how these things emerged? What we saw over the past century has actually shown that there can be gains made, but there can also be retraction, and that's the kind of period that we're in right now.
Dr. Diane Ravitch was one of the national leaders in developing corporate-driven education policies like No Child Left Behind. She was the Assistant Secretary of Education under George H.W. Bush, and she was appointed by the Clinton administration to oversee federal testing. Today, Diane Ravitch is a professor at New York University and one of the most prominent critics of the policies she helped create. Listen to her reflect on her most unusual transformation.
I was for many years on the right. I worked in the George H.W. administration. When No Child Left Behind was proposed, I supported it. And I belonged to two major right-wing think tanks, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute in Washington, D.C., and the Caret Task Force at the Hoover Institution in California. And I would have to say that over the years, as the evidence accumulated about No Child Left Behind, I became convinced that it was not helping anybody. It was actually doing damage. My views began to change in response to what I saw as very strong evidence that we were on the wrong path. And the more I came to this conclusion, the more my worldview changed. And I know that it's very unusual for someone in public life to change sides, but I very publicly changed sides. And I became increasingly outspoken in acknowledging that teaching is, first of all, it's a very hard job, and that the biggest problem in American education is not bad teachers, which is the current narrative on all sides, but poverty. We have outrageous levels of child poverty in this country. It's getting worse. And talking about charters and vouchers, Common Core, these are all just a distraction from dealing with the most fundamental issue, which is that our society is tolerating growing racial segregation and levels of child poverty that are unknown in other countries that are similar to our own.
Wow, that's a remarkable journey. Your latest book, Reign of Error, surveys the dominant narratives about education today and the major pillars of the corporate education agenda. It is very well researched and documented, and I really recommend it to listeners. Let's start with the narrative that the public education system has failed, the racial achievement gap is widening, and the U.S. is becoming less competitive in the world economy as a result.
The dominant narrative has nothing to do with the reforming schools. It really is intended to destroy public confidence in public education so that the public is willing to try anything. And there are many alternatives now being offered that have no evidence at all behind them and would destroy what I consider to be an essential institution of a democratic society, and that is a free public system of education that's adequately funded. The irony of all of this is American schools today, despite all the complaints, are doing better than they've ever done in history. Despite everything you may have seen in the mainstream media, graduation rates are the highest they've ever been in history for every group, white, black, Hispanic, and Asian. Dropout rates are the lowest they've ever been in history. And the test scores on the only national measure we have, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the test scores are the highest they've ever been in history. They have not gone up very much in the last dozen years of No Child Left Behind, despite all the pressure, despite all the high stakes, despite all the threats, merit pay and all that sort of nonsense. The biggest gains were made before No Child Left Behind. So we've seen a slowing down of the improvement, but nonetheless, our test scores are higher than ever. And our schools are doing an incredible job, despite the fact that in most states the budgets have been cut, enrollment's going up, the number of teachers is going down, and we have more children today with special needs, with disabilities, more children who are English language learners who don't speak English and need extra help, and more children living in poverty. I mean, nationally, it's almost a quarter of our children. In many schools, it's the majority of the children.
One of the major pillars of the corporate education agenda is standardized curriculum and testing. Proponents claim that the best way to measure the success or failure of students, teachers, and schools is through standardized tests, and the results prove that the educational system is failing.
At bottom, these claims are baseless, firstly because the standardized tests just aren't that good. If you want to predict test scores, the single most reliable predictor would be family income and family education. Actually, family income matters even more than race at this point, and I quote the research by Sean Reardon at Stanford, and he's an economist who found that the racial achievement gap was not nearly as large as the income achievement gap. So if you want the single most reliable predictor of low test scores, it would be family income. And then when you add into that, not just poverty, but segregation. It's what, in my book, I call it a toxic mix. And wherever there is high levels of segregation and high levels of poverty, you will find low test scores. And you read stories about how these tests are scored, and it just curdles the blood to think that kids are being stamped good or bad based on people who are being paid minimum wage, based on people who are hired off of Craigslist. Who in many cases, or in most cases, are not educators, and they're being paid by how many tests and how quickly they can score them. And, the kids may have poured their heart into their answer, but their answer is given 15 or 20 or 30 seconds, and it's like boom, boom, boom. The testing industry has been fattening. They have lobbyists in Washington. I mean, this was a shock to me. And I just thought all these decisions were made on the basis of what's best for kids, and it's not true. They're made on the basis of what's best for the bottom line, what's best for profits. So we see in many, many schools, the things that are not tested don't get taught. We see schools and districts narrowing the curriculum, eliminating the arts, or firing arts teachers, firing their librarians, putting millions and millions more into test prep materials bought from the same vendors. And meanwhile, what we're abandoning is the idea that schools have larger purposes than just raising test scores. The larger purposes are they're supposed to create citizens. They're supposed to educate young people to have full and rounded lives that include the arts, that include thinking and asking questions, not just answering the right question.
Standardized tests are supposed to be measuring standardized curriculum like the Common Core. Can you explain for our listeners what Common Core is and whether you see it as a step forward or backwards at this point?
The whole push behind Common Core, as started in 2009, was that American schools need a national curriculum, national standards, standardized instruction, and it needs to be much, much harder. And if you make it harder and more rigorous, then supposedly kids will learn more and they will have higher test scores, and our test scores will soar to the top of the world. Well, there's no evidence for any of that. As it happens, there are very high-performing nations that have national standards, but there are also very low-performing nations that have national standards. There are states like California that have some of the best standards in the country, and yet performance is low. Why is performance low? Because so many kids in California come from non-English speaking homes, and they have to learn the English language before they can begin to learn academic content. So many kids live in poverty, and poverty can be extremely distracting when you're homeless, when you haven't had proper medical care, you haven't had a vision check, or haven't been to a dentist. These things do get in the way of academic achievement. But the assumption behind Common Core is just make everything more rigorous and everyone will learn more, and there's no evidence for it. In fact, just recently, Forbes magazine published an article by Alice Walton. Her article concluded that the evidence is not there, and in fact, the Common Core, particularly in the early grades, is developmentally inappropriate. And she interviewed many of the leading early childhood education specialists in the country who said children learn at different rates, they grow at different rates, and yet Common Core makes these demands based on the expectation that everyone can learn in a lockstep way, and if only you set the standards high enough, everyone will achieve them. But there's no evidence for that.
Another part of the dominant narrative is that teachers' unions are protecting the bad teachers who are responsible for public school failure. A major pillar, then, of the corporate education agenda is to break the power of unions and undermine teachers' rights. Teachers that raise their students' test scores should get merit pay. Those that don't should be fired. Get rid of tenure and seniority rights. Many veteran teachers have been replaced with cheaper, younger, minimally trained recruits from programs like Teach for America. What should we understand about this assault on teachers and their unions?
This occurs at a time where I believe we're facing a national teacher shortage because so many teachers are leaving. They're discouraged. They feel demeaned and disrespected by the public discourse. But teacher tenure means that teachers have the right to due process. It means nothing more than that the teacher can't be fired without just cause. And that's only fair because sometimes people are fired because they earn too much. And the principal would rather have 2 young teachers than 1 senior teacher. I think that if tenure were abolished, we will see parts of this country in which teachers won't dare to teach evolution, in which they won't dare to teach any of the books on the American Library Association's list of the most censored books. I mean, even the Harry Potter books are banned in some districts. So we have to protect academic freedom, and teachers should not be fired because they chose to teach a book that some parent objected to. So I'm very much in support of teachers having due process rights, and I would say that if you want to look at the attack on unions, the reason that unions are attacked is because they defend teachers' rights, and the people who want to be able to easily fire teachers and keep them intimidated attack unions because they are the defenders of teachers. There is absolutely no correlation between having a union and having good outcomes.
At the heart of the corporate education agenda is privatization. Corporatizers want to shut down public schools with low test scores and turn them over to private companies to run as taxpayer-funded charter schools. They want to give vouchers for private school tuition, including for religious schools. They say every family deserves the choice of a quality school, and the private sector will do this better than government. What does the data actually say about the impact of privatization?
Well, we've actually had now 20 years of charter schools and vouchers. In state after state, the charter schools perform about the same, and in many cases, and I don't know if it's most cases, but many cases they actually underperform the public schools. But what is, I think, very invidious about the charter movement is that the charter schools take a smaller proportion or minimal proportion of kids with special needs. They don't want them. They say they don't have the staff or facilities to deal with kids with disabilities. So then the public schools get a disproportionate number of those kids as the charter schools absorb the kids they want. The charter schools also have disproportionately small numbers of English language learners. So these are the 2 groups of kids who need the most intensive support and are the most expensive to educate, and they are disproportionately in public schools, not in charter schools. The charters have the ability to suspend, and they suspend at far higher rates than public schools. They also just counsel kids out. Now, the kind of charter that is the most, I think, sort of unacceptable, intolerable, ridiculous, is the for-profit charter school. And some states don't permit for-profit charters, but on the other hand, they allow charter boards to hire for-profit companies to manage them. And it's crazy when you think about it that there are taxpayers paying out whatever they're paying, however many millions or billions of dollars, and some part of this has got to go to investors instead of in the classroom. It's not going to buy art supplies. It's not going to reduce class size. It's going to investors. And in Michigan, for example, close to 80% of the charter schools are operated specifically for profit, which means that the state is losing a huge amount of money to for-profit companies that have to pay their investors off. But the worst of the charters is the virtual charter. Virtual charters have a high dropout rate, a high churn rate. In many cases, the teachers will be monitoring anywhere from 50 to 75 to 100 different screens, and they're very low-wage teachers as compared to regular public schools or even to regular charter schools. But the companies are collecting a lot of money. They're very profitable.
Let's break for a moment. When we return, we'll look more closely at the most powerful backers of the corporate education agenda. But first, listen to this.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz? You ungrateful creatures! Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
You are? I don't believe you.
No, I'm afraid it's true. There's no other wizard except me. You humbug! Yes, it's exactly so. I'm a humbug.
Oh.
And now back to Diane Ravitch for more on who's behind the curtain.
The most powerful funder of the corporate education agenda would be the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has been underwriting not only charter schools, but also this search for the perfect metric by which to measure teachers. And they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on teacher evaluation, and it doesn't work. The whole Common Core endeavor, which cost about over $200 million, was funded by the Gates Foundation. Eli Broad Foundation has been very important because they have run an unaccredited superintendent training program for several years, and many of the superintendents across the country have been trained by the Eli Broad Foundation, and their main objective seems to be closing public schools and opening charter schools. A huge funder is the very far right-wing Walton Foundation. So you have the Walton Foundation, which is the Walmart fortune, spending about $150 to $160 million every single year on an agenda of privatization. And then there are other foundations, the Dell Foundation, the Fisher Foundation, the John Arnold Foundation. He was an Enron trader for many years. And the numbers of foundations following the lead of the Gates Foundation are in the dozens. All of these foundations are enabled and magnified. Their voices are magnified because they're working in concert with the U.S. Department of Education. So you have a bipartisan policy. Arne Duncan is the chief cheerleader for charter schools, for Teach for America.
And why are all these people so invested in this agenda?
There are some people who are driven by money and who see profit, but there are people who don't have a profit incentive, but just believe that you let the free market work its miracle, and with all this competition, it will raise test scores.
We'll leave it there for today. The most powerful men and women behind the curtain are much more sophisticated these days. They have co-opted and mastered the language of progressive educational reform. It's often hard to tell who is really speaking. They have enlisted an army of think tanks, politicians, public relations firms, and corporate media to sell their message. It's all about leaving no child behind, certainly not about opening up a $1 trillion education market for corporate profit. Those behind the curtain tap into legitimate criticisms of educational inequity and public school failure. This is fertile ground to reshape public education into their corporatized image, yet they want no accountability for their role in creating a society characterized by massive income inequality and systemic oppression. That is what contextualizes all of daily life in the schools and beyond.
Okay, so there will be some opportunity for us to engage in discussion following these clips. I want to kind of take it as we think about some of what Diane Ravitch brought up relating to No Child Left Behind. the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed in 2015 under Obama, in place, makes some important changes from Nickleby or No Child Left Behind. One is that it eliminates the adequate yearly progress, or AYP, and highly qualified teacher delineations. Nickleby was well known for its high stakes testing and accountability programs, of which there were many, so those were eliminated. Also eliminates the requirement for teacher-principal evaluation systems and or linking results to student test scores, right? So a teacher's the notion of merit pay and whether or not teachers were viewed as effective being completely predicated upon how students competed on these standardized tests was eliminated under ESSA. It also eliminates prescribed interventions in identified schools, right? So schools who were not meeting levels of proficiency had specific interventions. It could have been taken over by the state or elsewhere, other bodies, federal bodies, to look at implementation of particular interventions. So that was removed under ESSA, as were school improvement grant funds and requirements. It also migrates the Title III language proficiency accountability requirements to Title I. So just to clarify, Title III is the Language Instruction for English Learner and Immigrant Students Act under ESSA. And the function of Title III is to really help make sure that English language students attain English language proficiency and their ability to engage in challenging course material on par with students for whom English is their first language or primary language. Title I is really looking at improving academic achievement in support, particularly for, quote, disadvantaged students. So this helps students who are identified as experiencing disadvantage to meet state academic content and performance standards. So by moving the Title III language proficiency into Title I, it's recognizing that students who are English learners are in need of greater support, financial remuneration, and advantage. So that's an important change under ESSA. And it also reduces the authority of the U.S. Secretary of Education. As we talked about in the earlier lectures, there's a constant tension and change between federal oversight and the role of the federal government, which has always been intended to be small as it relates to education, and also the role of the states and local government. So certainly this started under ESSA, and when Secretary DeVos under the Trump administration came on board, we started to definitely hear more about the ways in which the federal government is interested in consolidating the role of the Secretary of Education. And we will probably hear a bit more about that before too long. So again, ESSA was signed into law under Obama in 2015, requiring every state that receives federal money for low-income students and English learners to submit and receive approval of a plan for managing and using those funds. So California's focus for our plan, and our plan was signed off by Secretary DeVos after quite a bit of back and forth. California is often kind of goes its own way to a certain degree, and so some disagreement was expected, but it was signed and approved. So the focus for California's state plan is to improve classroom learning for all students, especially those who need extra help. California also looks to spread out its support at a district level versus an individual school level, recognizing that challenges at individual schools are usually a reflection of larger needs, and so that's something that California took on. The Title I funds that we do receive through ESSA represent 2% of our total education budget. The fact that English language proficiency was moved under Title I, as we've talked about in prior lectures, under vulnerable populations. You know that English learners represent a huge percentage of our student population, almost 20% of our total student body in the state of California. And so it's important for us to make sure that our programs are adequately funded. Clearly, 2% of our total education budget is not a whole lot, but it is a significant number of students. And as we've talked about, the local control funding formula also, looks to help fill in some of those gaps in terms of meeting the needs of the student population. So this California School Dashboard is a place where schools reflect their evaluation of themselves, both schools and districts, on several data points that relate to specific student groups, like homeless, foster youth, and students with disabilities. So I just want to briefly show you what the dashboard looks like, and I put a link to it on B-Courses so you can see it. So this is what the dashboard looks like. And so since we're at Berkeley, why don't we take a look at schools in the city of Berkeley. So if you type in Berkeley, so we just, this is new, so we have 2017 and 2018 data, so let's look at the most current. And since we've been talking about English learners, and as we learned earlier, there's a much larger percentage of English learners in our K-6 schools. So let's take a look at one of our elementary schools. So I just want to show you, actually before I do that, it's important to know the key before you look at any type of data. So I'm not sure why it's not right at the top. I feel like it's almost hard to find it. But in any event, the actual dashboard has the little pencil, and it kind of shows ratings. So you can look. Red means lowest performance, orange, yellow, green, and then blue means highest performance. Okay, so from lowest to highest. So again, if we go back to Berkeley, and we can go to Malcolm X Elementary. So let's see, Malcolm X, you can see the range of areas to report, looking at chronic absenteeism, suspension rate, ELA, English Language Arts, and Mathematics performance. And then you can see the English learner progress has no performance color. So if we click on that to kind of learn a little bit more, what you find is you can learn more. English learner progress. It looks like that's about what they have at the moment. You can also compare to the state, looking at English learner progress at the state level. So that's a pretty detailed level of assessment and performance. You look at who is at what level for testing and performance. So, I think it's important to kind of think about always looking at the comparisons. How does the school fare compared to the rest of the state? So there's a lot of detail here on the dashboard. I invite you to kind of explore it a little bit as you get to know how it works. And parents may also find that really useful. So I also posted another article on B-Courses called The Invisible Achievement Gap by Wested, focused on foster youth in particular. And again, I know this is a group that we talked a bit about under vulnerable populations, but there's a couple things just when we think about the achievement gap per se that we want to make sure to address. That foster youth are a subgroup that's distinct from low-income students as a whole. Foster youth are consistently among the lowest performing subgroups in math and in English. Foster youth represent the highest, quote, dropout rates and are less likely to graduate. And as noted before, I tend to put dropout in quotation marks because dropout the word dropout to me reinforces a notion that it's volitional, and I think there are a number of ways in which the systems will fail our students, and our students feel pushed out and are pushed out by the behavior of adults, by policies, and also by life circumstances that are oftentimes outside of their control. So I just want to acknowledge that. Foster youth are also more likely than the general population to be in our lowest performing schools, just by nature of where they're placed, where they're living. That's important for us to think about. Foster youth are also twice as likely to be designated with a disability, which has an impact on, quote, achievement, and are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with, quote, emotional disturbance. And, we talked a bit about emotional disturbance when we looked at special education. I think there are some really important questions that are coming up across the country as to whether or not trauma is a disability, and whether or not PTSD or other diagnoses that speak to a history of trauma, which many of our foster youth have experienced. That emotional disturbance really is not an adequate way of making sense of the behavior that we see among foster youth. And our foster youth are more likely to change schools during the year, right? So that's going to impact achievement in terms of keeping track of where we're at and getting ready for an assessment test, or continuity of content. We're not in a situation in the state of California where teachers are lockstep within the same school, or even the same district, or even the same county, let alone moving counties, cities, districts, right? And what I mean by not lockstep, it's not like, on Thursdays, on Thursday we're all on page 87 of the math book. We all may be using different texts, have different pacing. So students may, again, miss quite a lot in terms of what they were exposed to when they have to change schools, which all impacts achievement. Again, it's important for us to remember these pieces and not just look at the numbers. And that the numbers are often divided by gender and racial groups. There's often a lot of other things that we're not looking at when we think about this, quote, achievement gap. To that end, this has been in the news very recently, and on B Courses I put a link to a podcast from EdSource. This was also in the Wall Street Journal within the last couple of days from when I'm recording this in May of 2019, of acknowledging what's being called an adversity index on the SAT standardized test that a lot of students need to take to get into college. This idea of whether or not they're acknowledging income inequality. So the College Board, who produces the SAT, have created this tool to provide environmental context behind the students' test scores. And the idea is that they're divided into 3 general categories of neighborhood environment, family environment, and the high school environment. And that the students, at least as it's currently kind of being put together, that the students wouldn't see the scores that they got under this, but that the colleges would. And so neighborhood environment looks at issues of crime and poverty rate, housing values, the vacancy rate. The family environment looks at issues of median income, whether or not there's a single parent, their education level, and whether or not the family may speak English as a second language or may not speak English. And then the high school environment, if there's an undermatching in terms of looking at college, the degree of curricular rigor, including whether or not there's an opportunity to take AP courses, advanced placement courses, which are courses where students can earn college credit, generally if they score a 4 or a 5 out of 5 on that test. Sometimes they can get some credit for a score of a 3. And also looking at the high school environment if they have their rate of free lunch, which gives some indication about levels of poverty in the school. So I'm curious what you all think about this. And, do you think this can help us, can help colleges to kind of understand students in context? What do you think of this decision? Do you think students should be able to see the test scores related to the adversity index? Do you think it should be used at all? This will be some of the subject of some of our discussion this week. So I want to invite you to think about that in relation to other content we've covered here and also through our reading and viewing for this week. So as I mentioned at the top, there will be an activity next week called the Data Equity Walk, where we're going to take a closer look at some of this content through an activity. So I do invite you to engage in that, and I will be posting additional information about how to do that. So I will look forward to connecting with you in the next segment that focuses on learning and motivation, which is directly related and often talked about in concert together with the achievement gap. Okay, thanks so much for your time. Talk to you soon.